The rain had been a whisper on the forecast, just enough to intrigue someone like me. A lone backpack, a sturdy pair of boots, and a longing for solitude drove me into the forest's embrace. The path ahead, overgrown and slick with early drizzle, meandered deeper into the woods. Each step squelched softly against the damp earth, and the cool air carried the scent of wet leaves and distant pine. I chose this trip carefully, not because I expected it to be easy, but because I needed something different. Life in the city was noise, constant, suffocating, and relentless. Out here, every sound felt deliberate. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant murmur of a stream winding through the wilderness. My pack carried essentials, meticulously chosen for what lay ahead. A compact hot tent, rain gear, a sturdy stove, and rations packed tightly into waterproof containers. Every item had its place. Each choice felt significant, a small reassurance against the uncertainty the storm would bring. The rain started as a faint drizzle, speckling my jacket and dampening the vibrant greens around me. It wasn't menacing, not yet. The sky above was a muted gray, clouds thickening but not yet threatening. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I walked, the path winding through groves of towering trees that swayed gently in the growing breeze. The world around me felt alive, its pulse steady and calm despite the changing weather. After an hour of hiking, I reached a brook, a steady ribbon of water carving its way through the forest. The sound was soothing, a natural metronome that kept my pace even. Here, beneath the shelter of ancient trees with sprawling branches, I decided to set up camp. The spot was ideal, slightly elevated to avoid pooling water, with enough of a canopy to shield me from the worst of the rain. Unpacking was methodical. The tent came first, its poles snapping together with satisfying precision. I staked it down carefully, driving each peg deep into the softened soil, double-checking the tension of the guy lines. The fabric, designed to repel water, shimmered faintly in the damp light. Inside, I spread out my sleeping pad and sleeping bag, layering them for warmth. The stove was next, a compact model that fit snugly in one corner of the tent. I placed it on a heat-resistant mat, testing its stability before lighting it. The small flame flickered to life, its warmth immediately comforting against the cool air creeping in. Outside, the drizzle intensified, tapping rhythmically against the tent's surface. Thunder grumbled in the distance, low and drawn out, like a warning still too far away to feel urgent. I paused, listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an almost eerie stillness. I checked my gear one last time, ensuring everything was secure. My pack, tucked safely into a corner, held my remaining supplies, each item wrapped in plastic to guard against the wet. The stove hissed softly, a reassuring constant amid the growing tension of the weather. As I sat inside the tent, sipping from a flask of warm tea, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and unease. There was a thrill in being out here, alone and exposed to the elements, but it was tempered by the awareness of how quickly conditions could change. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and the rain began to fall in earnest, its rhythm quickening against the tent. I took a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling my lungs. This was what I had come for. Not just the challenge, but the quiet intensity of being surrounded by nature, of facing something bigger and more unpredictable than myself. For now, everything was under control. The tent was secure, the stove was warm, and I was ready for whatever the storm would bring. The first crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the dense forest in a stark, ghostly white. Almost immediately, thunder followed, rolling over the trees like a giant's drumbeat. The calm drizzle transformed into a deluge, sheets of rain hammering against the tent with a ferocity that made the fabric quiver. Every drop sounded amplified, like 1,000 tiny drumsticks beating relentlessly. Inside the tent, I adjusted the guy lines again, tightening them to counter the wind that now howled through the trees. The once soothing murmur of the brook had grown into an angry roar, its waters swollen and rushing with newfound force. I could feel the dampness creeping into the edges of the tent as the ground struggled to absorb the unrelenting downpour. The air felt electric, charged with the storm's intensity. Each flash of lightning illuminated the interior of the tent for a split second, casting sharp shadows that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The stove's flame flickered unsteadily, and I reached over to shield it, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't the cold. I was warm enough, but the sudden shift in the environment had my nerves on edge. A gust of wind tore through the forest, bending branches and sending a spray of rainwater cascading down. The tent shook violently, and I braced myself, pushing against the poles to keep it steady. Outside, the storm roared, a chaotic symphony of wind, water, and thunder. The first real sign of trouble came when I noticed water pooling at the base of the tent. Despite my efforts to choose a higher ground, the sheer volume of rain had overwhelmed the forest floor. I scrambled to move my gear, propping it up on makeshift platforms of dry bags and whatever else I could find. My sleeping bag, thankfully, remained untouched, its waterproof casing holding firm. Then came the lightning. One strike hit so close that the entire forest lit up as if a spotlight had been turned on. The accompanying thunder was instantaneous, a deafening crack that seemed to reverberate through my chest. My heart raced, the primal fear of nature's power washing over me. I forced myself to stay focused, to control my breathing and prioritize tasks. The stove, the only source of heat and comfort, sputtered ominously. I quickly adjusted the fuel valve, coaxing the flame back to life. Its soft orange glow was a small but vital reassurance in the chaos. Another gust of wind howled through, and I heard the unmistakable crack of a tree branch giving way. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it hit the tent? What if I had to evacuate? I glanced at the emergency whistle hanging from my pack, a small but potent reminder that out here, I was completely alone. The tent groaned under the weight of the storm, but it held. I double-checked the stakes, ensuring they hadn't shifted, and tightened the rainfly. My hands were cold, the dampness seeping through my gloves as I worked quickly. Every move felt deliberate, each action a small victory against the storm's relentless assault. The next challenge came when the stove faltered again. Water had found its way into the tent despite my best efforts, pooling dangerously close to the heat-resistant mat. I repositioned it, creating a small barrier, using spare clothing to absorb the moisture. The flame flickered but didn't go out, a fragile beacon in the storm. I tried to distract myself by listening to the storm, letting its rhythm wash over me. The wind howled, the rain hammered, and the thunder growled, but I was still here, still holding on. The tent's interior felt smaller than ever, a thin barrier between me and the chaos outside. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the ground. A tree branch, heavy and sodden, had fallen mere feet from the tent. The sound was visceral, a sharp reminder of how fragile the situation was. I froze for a moment, heart pounding, before forcing myself to move, to check the damage. The tent remained intact, but the proximity of the branch was a stark warning. I sat back down, exhaustion beginning to creep in. My hands were steady now, my mind calmer despite the chaos outside. The storm raged on, but I was still here, alive and adapting. Each challenge felt like a test, each solution a step toward survival. The thunder began to roll further away, and though the rain still lashed against the tent, there was a slight shift in the air. The storm's fury was beginning to wane, but it had left its mark. I leaned back, listening to the rain, my breathing steady now. The worst was over, but the memory of its power would linger long after. The rain had softened, its relentless hammering replaced by a steady patter that whispered against the tent. The wind, once howling and furious, now wove gentle currents through the forest, rustling the soaked leaves with an almost apologetic calm. I pushed the tent flap open slightly, careful not to disturb the fragile sense of peace. A pale gray light filtered through the trees, revealing the aftermath of the storm. The brook that had been a soft murmur when I arrived was now a rushing torrent, its banks swollen and churning with muddy water. Fallen branches littered the ground, some small and harmless, others thick enough to remind me of how close disaster had come. I stared at the broken limb that had crashed mere feet from the tent, its jagged edges a stark reminder of the night's ferocity. Inside, the tent felt like a sanctuary, worn but intact. My gear was scattered across the limited space, drying in makeshift arrangements. The sleeping bag, though slightly damp at the edges, remained serviceable, and the stove still emitted a steady warmth. I turned my attention to organizing what remained, setting aside wet clothing to wring out, and using spare plastic bags to separate anything salvageable from the waterlogged mess. I brewed a fresh cup of tea, the act slow and deliberate. The softness of the stove and the rising steam brought a quiet comfort that stood in stark contrast to the storm's chaos. I cradled the cup, its warmth seeping into my fingers, and stared out at the clearing sky. The forest felt transformed. What had been wild and untamed during the storm now felt subdued, almost tender in its recovery. The trees, stripped of their excess water, stood tall again, their trunks dark with rain and their branches glistening like polished glass. The air was crisp, carrying the clean scent of rain-soaked earth and a faint tang of ozone. I ventured outside cautiously, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The world felt fragile, as though stepping too heavily might shatter the delicate balance the storm had left behind. I began inspecting the area, taking stock of the damage and ensuring my surroundings were still safe. The elevated spot I had chosen had spared me from the worst of the flooding, but the brook's proximity served as a stark reminder of how quickly nature could shift from tranquil to threatening. As I moved around, the weight of the night began to settle in. The storm had tested me, not just physically but mentally. I replayed the moments in my mind. The lightning that lit up the forest, the thunder that shook the ground, the tree branch crashing too close for comfort. Yet, despite it all, I was still here. There was a strange beauty in the aftermath, a reminder of nature's duality. The same forces that had threatened to upend my small camp now revealed a world refreshed and renewed. Puddles dotted the forest floor, their surfaces rippling with the occasional drop of water that fell from overhead branches. The brook, though louder and more forceful, carried with it an energy that felt alive, vibrant. Back at the tent, I worked to rebuild my space, reinforcing what it held and adjusting what hadn't. The stakes were checked and reset where necessary, the rainfly resecured to ensure it would hold if the weather turned again. Each task felt purposeful, a small act of reclaiming control in an environment that had reminded me how little I truly had. As the day wore on, the sky began to clear, patches of soft blue appearing between the lingering clouds. The sunlight that filtered through the canopy was weak but warm, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. I took a moment to sit by the brook, watching its restless flow and sipping another cup of tea. The experience had been humbling. There was a time, during the peak of the storm, when fear had gripped me tightly, whispering doubts about whether I had made the right choice in coming here. But that fear had given way to determination, each challenge met with a resolve I hadn't fully realized I possessed. The forest, too, had endured. It stood as a testament to resilience, weathering the storm's wrath, an emerging change but intact. I felt a kinship with it now, an unspoken understanding of what it meant to face something vast and uncontrollable and to emerge on the other side. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden hue across the clearing, I began to pack up. Each item returned to its place, carefully cleaned and folded, the routine grounding me after the night's chaos. The tent, once a fragile refuge, now felt like a symbol of perseverance, its fabric still strong despite the battering it had endured. When the last of my gear was secured, I took one final look around. The storm had left its mark, fallen branches, deepened rivulets in the ground, a heightened sense of respect for the forces at play. But it had also left something else, a deep appreciation for the stillness that followed, the way the world seemed to breathe again, softer and slower. As I began the trek back, the forest seemed to envelop me in its quiet embrace. The storm was behind me, its memory etched into every step I took. I felt lighter, not because the experience had been easy, but because it had reminded me of something essential, that even in the face of chaos, there is strength in enduring, and sometimes that's enough.